Either today or around today is going to be the Zelda series' 35th anniversary, and even though I've never played any games of this series on the channel, it's still a video game series that I've played most of, and I thought this would be a perfect opportunity for me to just discuss my thoughts on the various games in the series, and the order that I personally rank them in. And let me just get this sorted right now, this is my own personal opinion, how much I personally enjoy each of these games. I'm saying this because some of the games that I rank low are very highly regarded by the fan base, and some of the games that I rank very high are not so highly regarded. But I have very particular tastes when it comes to Zelda. It's a series that has a lot of different focuses and often shifts focus in every installment. Because of that, it's a series that can lead to some very polarized opinions, as what you like in Zelda might be the thing they're not focusing on in this particular game. I actually explained my thoughts on what I play Zelda games for in part 5 of my Super Smash Bros. Ultimate World of Light series. I'd actually recommend going and checking that video out because not many of my opinions have changed since that video. To rank the games, I've used something very similar to the character sorters that I've done in previous videos on this channel. This one was for Zelda games, though it's a little bit outdated. In these sorters, you're presented with two options, and you choose which of the two you like better. You keep doing this until you're given a full sorted list of all of the elements that you chose between. So, without further ado, let's begin my list, starting with the never played section. Obviously, I can't rank any of these games. These ones are the Tingle games, the CDI games, as well as Link's Crossbow Training, Triforce Heroes, Cadence of Hyrule, and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Have not played any of these. Out of them, the only game I'd really consider playing is Cadence of Hyrule, and even then, I'm horrible at rhythm games, so I don't really know if it would be a game that I'd particularly enjoy. Anyway, let's go into the games that I actually have played. Starting at number 19 on the list is Phantom Hourglass. Phantom Hourglass is the one Zelda game I've ever played that I have come the closest to considering outright bad. Most of the lower parts of this sorter are just, I like this game, but I like other games in the series more. Phantom Hourglass, I actually disliked playing this one for a number of reasons. I'm not normally against gimmicky touch and motion controls, I actually do a pretty good job of adjusting to them, but Phantom Hourglass in particular has one thing, rolling. Having to draw squiggly lines to roll was very unresponsive. This might seem like a nitpick, but it's really the least of my issues with this game. The main one is that you have to keep going back to the Temple of the Ocean King over and over again, and repeating the same, 20 floors that you've already been through. I have heard in recent years some people defend this, saying that it introduced them to the concept of speedrunning. I admit that's a good way to look at it, but I still don't like having to do the same thing over and over again. I also didn't really like the ocean exploration that much. Unlike Wind Waker, there weren't a lot of optional islands to discover, and the music wasn't even that great. The story, I'll just say, Bellum is probably my least favourite big bad in all of Zelda. You know how people give Calamity Ganon flack for being a mindless force of evil with no personality? Bellum is that, except Bellum doesn't even have earlier history with the series to flesh out their backstory. He's just kind of there. I'm not sure I even like the way Wind Waker's art style was transferred to the DS graphics either. I do have some positive things to say about the game though. Some of the dungeon items made pretty creative use of the touch controls, and the boss fights. The boss fights are some of the most creative use of the two screens of the DS I've ever seen. My personal favourite is the boss of the Temple of Courage, where it's invisible on the bottom screen, but the top screen is viewed through the boss's eyes. That's a really cool idea. Number 18 on my list is Four Swords, and this one I just feel isn't really a fair ranking because it's not a full game. It's either a bonus feature of another game or a budget DSiWare title depending on which version you're using. And that's really the only reason it ranks so low for me. I just can't put it any higher because it's not a full Zelda adventure. It almost feels more like an early tech demo for an idea for a multiplayer Zelda game. Speaking of which, the fact that you can only experience this game at its best with multiple players also hurts its ranking for me, because I played the GBA version of Link to the Past in high school when I had basically no friends, and in order to fully experience this, you need 3 friends who all have copies of the game. I remember I played one stage of this in multiplayer as a kid, but it wasn't a great experience since the person I did it with just kind of used the game as an excuse to show how much better they were at it than I was, and just sort of walked all over me. So yeah, my opinion might be a bit tainted by that. I never got to fully play through it until the DSiWare version, where you can play it in single player, and I did like the new content in that version, especially the one in the Link's Awakening art style. But overall, this game ranks this low specifically because it's just not a full game. But since I don't outright dislike it the way I do Phantom Hourglass, it gets a step above. Next up is number 17, and this is probably going to be a really controversial one, Link's Awakening. I realize making this sorter that I just don't like Link's Awakening all that much, and I can pinpoint exactly why. I played Oracle of Ages first. Oracle of Ages was actually my first Zelda, well technically it was my sister's first Zelda, but I played it occasionally. And it is in the same engine as Link's Awakening, but it has a lot more quality of life improvements. I didn't actually play Link's Awakening until very, very late into my experience with Zelda, so by the time I got to it, I'd been spoiled by most of the later handheld entries, and in particular, some aspects of it, like the fact that if you so much as brush up against a pot without the power bracelet equipped in one of your 2 item slots, wow, this is really heavy! You won't be able to lift it with just your bare hands! Every single time. And in Oracle of Ages and Seasons, that message never appears again after you find the power bracelet, which you get as like your first or second item depending on which game you're playing. But not so much in Link's Awakening. Also, the compass goes through 5 text boxes explaining that it has a new feature and it can tell you that there's a key in your room. They only needed to give you that explanation once. A whole lot of the dungeon design I just felt was personally better in Seasons and Ages, and this is where people are going to accuse me of being heartless, but I never really cared for Link's Awakening's story all that much, and in particular, I'm not really that big on Marin, and I know a lot of people are really going to hate me for that, and it's mainly because I just can't bring myself to ship Link with anyone who isn't Zelda. And it just kind of feels weird to me, Link having a non-Zelda love interest. The closest I've got to shipping a non-Zelink pair is, Ilia and Twilight Princess. However, I don't totally hate this game or anything. There are some things about it that I like. In particular, Eagle's Tower I think is a very good dungeon, one of my favourites in the series actually. And also, the story atmosphere around the Face Shrine in particular is fantastic. Without spoiling anything, the way the music in that dungeon feels like it's conveying what Link is going through emotionally at that point is amazing, really. This game also pioneered a lot of things that we take for granted in later Zelda games, like it was the first game where every dungeon had its own unique music track, for one. It was the first one to base dungeon puzzles mainly around items, and it was also the first to feature a musical instrument with multiple different songs you learn over the course of the game. I also love how brokenly fun the Fire Rod and the Boomerang are, as the last dungeon item and the reward for the item trading quest respectively, which is something else that debuted in this game, they really should be that overpowered. Finally, the remake did improve a lot of the quality of life aspects, though something that I've noticed watching a Let's Play of the remake, the world feels so much smaller now than it used to. Anyway, in summary, this is a game that I'd probably like more if I played it earlier, but well, I didn't. And well, if that didn't get me murdered, number 16 certainly will, Breath of the Wild. I've talked in videos a lot about my feelings on this game. I am not saying that it's not a good game. No, it's an amazing game, it deserves all the praise that it gets, and open world games should definitely draw influence from it in the future. I just don't like open world games personally. It's very much a personal taste thing. I sum it up as, I'm not the kind of person who plays games to get lost in a world, or to goof off. When I'm playing a game, I like to know that I'm making concrete, definable progress. I like my experience to be a bit more structured and a bit more ordered, and I just don't really like the whole chaotic, oh look, here's something I can get distracted by, here's something else I can get distracted by. Another thing that I'm not big on is the fact that they open up the whole world to you from the very beginning. To me, one of the most exciting things about Zelda is getting a new item and going, wow, look how much of the world has opened up to me after getting that item, and gradually opening up more and more the more items that you get. In this game, you're handed all of the Sheikah Slate powers in the first area, and then you can pretty much do anything you want, including the final boss, and to me, I just lose that sense of discovery and that sense of progress and getting stronger if everything is accessible from the start. You can tell that I'm a JRPG player here. I've actually noticed looking at a lot of videos on Breath of the Wild's game design, in the comments sections, many people who like this game are fans of Bethesda or Ubisoft, or at least are people who used to be fans of Bethesda and Ubisoft and wish their games were better now. But those are companies and franchises that I've never had any interest in personally. Combined with a lack of emphasis on story, the majority of interesting characters being dead since hundreds of years ago, all of the dungeons being very small and having the same aesthetic, that's actually a big one. It's part of why I don't really like the Divine Beasts. Getting into the Divine Beast was really cool, I admit, but once you're actually inside them, they all look and play virtually the same, and it's not even rewarding to explore them because, since they're one-time dungeons, everything in optional chests in the dungeons is just more of weapons and items you can get outside. And I know a lot of people like the approach to puzzles of, oh hey, that worked, was I supposed to do it that way? But to me, I actually find this unsatisfying. As somebody who plays a lot of mystery games like Ace Attorney, I get a lot of joy out of catching on to the developer's logic and their intended solutions, and trying to be on the same wavelength as they were. So when I play a Zelda game and I solve a puzzle and I think, was I really expected to do it that way? It just doesn't hit the same feeling of satisfaction for me. Again, if you like this kind of thing, this game is fantastic, but the reason why this game ranks low on my personal list is it's a sign that the things that I like about Zelda are not being prioritized anymore, and because of the huge influx of new fans this game caused, they don't need to prioritize those things anymore, and because of that, this game might sadly be the end of my journey with the series. I just don't see me enjoying another game that's in this style. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't played Age of Calamity. The other reason is that number 15 on this list is Hyrule Warriors. Now, Hyrule Warriors' placement on my list is very, very strange, because I actually really enjoyed the game. It's very fun. I'd never played a Warriors game before, but the varied movesets of all the characters, so much fun to play. I love how it's a love letter to the whole series up till that point, and it contains a lot of really hilarious nods for fans of the series, especially one of my favourite things about the game is playing as Ganondorf and just seeing him open a chest and do the item get pose. It's just so wrong that it wraps around to being hilarious. The reason why I rank this game so low is, one, it's not really a Zelda game. It's a Zelda-themed Warriors game, and because of this, it shouldn't really be judged with other Zelda games. And two, this game is an absolute nightmare to 100%. It's one of only 2 games I've ever rage quit out of getting 100% in, the other is Yoshi's Island. If you want to do absolutely everything there is in this game, you have to play so many adventure mode maps, and a lot of them are just the same style of fight over and over and over, and this was before the DLC came out and added like 5, I think even more adventure mode maps. It's just, I enjoy this game, but I never really try and 100% it because it feels very grindy, and I've heard that this isn't just this game, that all Warriors games are basically like this, and because of that, I doubt the Warriors series is my cup of tea either. I didn't get Fire Emblem Warriors for that reason, and also because I don't like its roster. But yeah, I'm glad I played this game, and I don't really dislike it or anything, but it's a game that I also kind of dread going back to just because of how daunting and draining 100% completion is. After Hyrule Warriors, at number 14 is the original Legend of Zelda. This game I didn't end up playing until way later when I had it on the 3DS Ambassador program, and one day during a holiday trip where I had nothing else to play, I decided to start it. And I was surprised at how well this game held up despite being so old. I did have the advantage of having watched and read a lot of walkthroughs on the game though, but I actually feel that looking back, its guide-dang-it nature maybe wasn't intended to be that way. I think this was a game that really benefited from playground culture and was designed around it. You were supposed to have friends who also played the game, and just talk to them about it, and you'd hear people say things like, hey, I played the whistle at an empty fairy fountain and I found a dungeon, and you're like, oh cool, I should try that, and you find something. I've heard this approach described as Zelda 1 is secretly a multiplayer game, and I think it sums it up quite well. So I don't think the bad translation or the guide dang-its really work against it if you think about the culture the game came out in. Other than that, there's not a ton that I have to say about this one. I enjoyed it when I played it, but there are other Zeldas that I enjoy more. And at number 13 is Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, another game I got via the 3DS Ambassador program that I liked playing on the go. The only reason this one's higher is the novelty factor, for lack of a better word. Zelda 2 is a game made at a time when Nintendo loved making their sequels radically different from the original game. And even now, Zelda 2 feels like nothing else in the series, but I still found it quite enjoyable. And I think that's mostly because of the combat system. This is one of the well, I mean, it's only the second game in the series, so of course it was one of the first Zeldas to do this, but it's one of the only Zeldas to have a combat system more complicated than hit things with sword repeatedly. Having crouch stabs, jumping stabs, a magic system, and different enemies that require hitting them in different spots, it really makes you think about the fighting, and there aren't a lot of Zeldas that have combat systems this... It's weird to describe an NES game as intricate, but that's really how I'd say it. Also, this game is really, really difficult, but I still find it very satisfying to actually get through, and honestly, dying is not that punishing overall, so the difficulty didn't bother me too much. There's not much else I have to say about this one, so I'll move on to number 12, Twilight Princess. We're getting into the mid-tier of my list, and Twilight Princess is a game that I actually haven't replayed since I first played it, so if I played it again recently, I might like it more, but as it stands, it's a game that does a lot of cool things, but in a way I almost feel it tries too hard. That sounds really mean, but bear with me. I feel like they just really wanted to make this game as epic as possible, and they really, really wanted it to be Ocarina of Time 2.0. They focused a lot on the story and character relationships, they had a decently big world, they had a very realistic art style, which means that as a result it actually hasn't aged as well as some other games that use more cartoony art styles. They had an epic plot about one world invading another. They had, and admittedly, a very cool and well-written sidekick character. Midna is definitely my favourite sidekick in all of Zelda, and she's a lot of people's. And also, a mechanic where the hero turns into an awesome wolf. A duel on a bridge set to epic music with epic camera angles. A lot of it really does feel very, look at us, we're epic, we're amazing, and I feel like you should just let that come naturally by making the game really good and memorable. And not that Twilight Princess isn't a good game, it's just that a lot of it just doesn't really stand out to me thinking back. I really wish the Hyrule Castletown Resistance got more focus, because they had a lot of potential. And the other thing I don't like about Twilight Princess is, a lot of Zeldas are guilty of this, but this one really is. Introducing really cool items that get like 3 uses in their dungeon and are never used again. The spinner and the Rod of Command or whatever it is you get in the Temple of Time. Those two are really, really guilty of this. I really wish the spinner was expanded on in another game, and the closest we ever got to that was Hyrule Warriors. That said, one thing I do like about this game is the sheer number of dungeons, and there's a decent amount of variety in them too. In this game, every time you think you're done with dungeons, the game throws another one at you. But looking back, some of the dungeons don't really stick out too much in my memory, so maybe having less dungeons but making them more memorable is a better experience overall, and you'll see that when I get to later entries in this list. Number 11 is A Link to the Past. To me, Link to the Past is the baseline Zelda, the one that I use to judge all the other games by. At the time, it would have been amazing, and I almost wish that I was there during the SNES era to experience it, because I'm sure it would have been like one of the best things ever, but I played it for the first time as the GBA remake, because it was a little bit before my time. And it's still a very solid game, with a decent story, good world, decent dungeons, but all in all, I feel like later games just took the things that it did and did them better. But it still deserves a lot of credit for pioneering those things to begin with. All in all, this game is very solidly average for me, but average for Zelda is still amazing. Number 10, and here we're getting into the games that I really, really like, so I'll have mostly positive things to say from now on. Four Swords Adventures. Four Swords Adventures did something that is a common theme for my top 10 Zelda games. It was a game that I didn't expect to like, but ended up really, really liking. I rented it on a whim from Blockbuster, and I thought that it would be really bad single player, because, again, I still had kinda no friends at this point. Not only is this game a full adventure, unlike the original Four Swords, it's also a surprisingly fun single player experience. I would definitely recommend any of you who are shying away from this game due to not having friends to play multiplayer with, to give it a try, because it's actually not that bad single player. In fact, in some ways, it's actually better played single player, because you don't need to worry about having to get all the GBAs together, or managing multiple screens. I like how you can arrange your links into different formations, each one having its own strengths and weaknesses, or you can split them up for when puzzles require them to do their own things. And while it's more linear and level-based than most games in the series, it's got quite a lot of content to it, a lot of areas to go through, as well as a lot of decent bonus features that are also pretty good multiplayer. And it also has some really nice visual effects, basically being a 2D version of Wind Waker's art style, and as Wind Waker hasn't shown up yet, you know that Wind Waker's probably high up on my list, so that's a plus for me. Number 9 is Oracle of Seasons, and I'll just say 8 is Oracle of Ages. I do think these two games are quite different. They were marketed as kind of a Pokemon Red and Blue kind of thing, but really that's not true. They're actually more like Fire Emblem Fate's Birthright and Conquest, two totally different games that happen to have the same engine and a bit of a linked story. Ages has the advantage of being my first Zelda ever, so it ranks a little higher for me on nostalgia alone, but also because it prioritizes different things. Ages focuses on puzzles, while Seasons is more combat-based. Something that I've also noticed about Seasons looking back is that it's also much lighter on plot than Ages is. Seasons doesn't really have much story other than bad guy kidnaps girl, you need to get MacGuffins to go to his castle and save her. And it's no coincidence that it feels like an older Zelda game, because it repurposes a lot of assets from a cancelled Game Boy remake of Zelda 1. In general though, I still really like Seasons, and it has a few advantages over Ages. Its main world is a lot bigger, the seasonal mechanic adds a lot of interesting puzzles to exploring things. There are some really cool items in Seasons that aren't in Ages at all, such as the magnetic gloves, which used to be at the top of my list for classic Zelda items I'd love to see reimagined in a 3D game. And then Breath of the Wild basically did that, so that was awesome. And I also really love the final boss fight of Seasons, definitely more so than Ages, which, despite me preferring that game overall, I think its final boss and final dungeon are one of the weakest parts of it. So let's get to Ages. Again, Ages has nostalgia value for me because it was my first Zelda. But I also just generally like a lot of it. Its world is smaller than Seasons, but it also has both a past and a present version of itself. And there are some really interesting areas to it too, such as the Tokay Island, which is one of my favourite areas in all Zelda. You crash there and you lose all your items, and you have to travel around the place talking to all of the villagers and trying to find out who stole what of your stuff and get them all back. Only once you finally reclaim your sword, which is obviously the last thing you get, can you make your way to the dungeon on the island. Eventide Island may have taken inspiration from that. Other areas that I remember loving, Symmetry City, a place you go to in the present and find it post-apocalyptic, leading you to travel to the past to change the events that led to the town's destruction. The Zora Sea, one of the only appearances of Ocarina of Time-style Zoras in a top-down Zelda. The Sea and Island of No Return, some mysterious ruins that aren't fully explained, where your time travel songs are flat out blocked from working, forcing you to get into its past version the hard way. The story also undergoes a very interesting plot development about halfway through that I don't want to say because it's a bit of a spoiler, but I think it's really cool personally. And especially Mermaid's Cave, my favourite dungeon in all of Zelda. It's a dungeon that exists in both the past and the present, and you have to explore both versions pretty much simultaneously. It just really ties together all of the time travel elements so far. The Oracle Duology also have an interesting mechanic, in that once you finish one game, you're given a password, which if you enter it into the other game, turns that game into a sequel to the first one, with characters from the first game showing up at points and continuing their own plot lines, and letting you face the true villains of the duology. You don't even need a link cable for this, all you need is passwords, which means it works between, for example, a Game Boy copy and a 3DS Virtual Console version. Anyway, the Oracle games are some of my favourites in the series, but there are others that I like even more than them. First one of those, at number 7, is A Link Between Worlds, another game that I didn't expect to like but ended up really loving. I thought this game would be a massive nostalgia pandering fest towards fans of Link to the Past, in the same way that a lot of modern Pokemon games love pandering to Gen 1 fans. But it turns out that despite sharing the same world and mimicking the art style, this game is very, very different from Link to the Past, and I can't quite describe why. It just has its own feel to it, which wasn't what I was expecting from the game. It is also one of the few Zelda games where money is actually kind of useful due to the rental system, which is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is it opens up a lot more of the game at any time, and I like the whole you can do the dungeon in any order mechanic. But the curse is that it means that some of the dungeon puzzles can't really be based around specific items. I think they still did a pretty good job of making the dungeons interesting despite these restrictions though. In particular, I really love the Palace of Darkness, and its gimmick actually being based around light and dark, unlike its very non-indicative name in Link to the Past. The story and characters were also pretty interesting, though I will say I'm not the biggest fan of Yuga. I feel like he was a bit of an attempt to cash in on Girahim's popularity, but he does defy Zelda conventions very late into the game in one way that I appreciate, but other than that, he's not my favourite villain. The wall merge mechanic I also find really fun and interesting too. Oh, and the music. This game has some of my favourite songs in the whole series, and that's saying something. This might actually be one of my favourite 3DS games, up there with Persona Q and Fire Emblem Awakening. At number 6 is Spirit Tracks. I sum up this game as, it fixed everything I disliked about Phantom Hourglass. The touch controls are a lot better. For one, rolling is no longer a squiggly line, but a double tap. The dungeon you keep returning to, you at least explore a different part of it every time. The antagonists are a lot more interesting. Even though Malladus is a generic demon, Cole is really fun and hammy, and Burn is a cool, semi-sympathetic villain that's really fun to fight. I also found the towns and side content a bit more interesting and memorable in this game than in Phantom Hourglass. This game is a bit controversial in modern times though, for the overworld being literally on rails, but as you can probably tell, as someone who doesn't really play this series for the exploration, I don't mind it, and I actually found getting around with the train to be pretty fun. Though the Phantom trains being one-hit kills was admittedly a little bit unfair. The other thing that I'm not really keen on in this game, the pipes. Having to actually physically blow into them while moving them on the touchscreen was kind of hazardous to your health sometimes. This is another game that I feel also had a really, really great soundtrack. The final battle theme in particular is one of my favorite tracks in the series. Also, Zelda is kind of a playable character in this one, and sort of a party member for most of the journey, so you got to see her and Link spend most of the game together, which was pretty nice. Number 5, the Minish Cap. This game was made by Capcom, the makers of the Oracle games, so of course I like it. But I kind of surprised myself in ranking it above them. Overall though, I feel Minish Cap is pretty underrated and a really solid game for what it is. It's relatively short, but also not too long either. Its length feels just right to me. And while I'm normally not a graphics guy, I will say this game looks absolutely gorgeous. It has some of my favourite graphics on the Game Boy Advance, and its music is pretty good too. I also think most of its dungeons are very fun and well designed, and story-wise, it deserves major props for turning Vati, a villain I previously considered boring and generic, into my favourite villain in the series next to Ganon, for actually giving him a backstory and a lot of presence throughout the adventure. He actually felt really threatening in the end, and he also had a really great 3-stage final boss fight. Kinda think of it, it might be one of my favourite final bosses in the series. I don't know if this game got a lot of fanfare back when it was released, but if you haven't tried it yet, I definitely recommend checking it out. And now we come to number 4, which may shock you. For me, it's Ocarina of Time. Just hear me out for a second. I think that Ocarina of Time has the perfect balance of exploration, combat, puzzles, and story. It has something for everyone, no matter what kind of Zelda fan you are. And it's also a game that I recommend that anybody, even non-gamers, play at least once in their life. In fact, if you were to ask me what I think is objectively the greatest video game ever made, I would probably say Ocarina of Time. It's that good, and I think that when video games are one day studied as an art form, this should be the Shakespeare of video games. There's almost nothing negative I have to say about this. It's the closest thing to a perfect game I've ever played. And yet it's only number 4 on my list. Why is that? Well, something that I've discovered about myself recently is that perfection is kind of boring. I would rather like something in spite of its flaws than have something that I consider completely flawless. I think Path of Radiance is objectively a better game than Radiant Dawn, but Radiant Dawn's still my favourite Fire Emblem. I think Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is objectively better than Xenoblade 2, but I like Xenoblade 2 more. Sometimes flaws make a game more memorable to me, and I'd rather have that than a totally perfect experience. And so the next 3 on my list are games that definitely have things that I don't like about them, but also are just so much more memorable to me for other reasons that they make up my top 3. So, number 3, Majora's Mask. And once again, this game is this high because I didn't expect to like it, but ended up loving it. When I first heard about this game, I was like, only 4 dungeons, really? All the dungeon items are just different types of arrows? And having to reset to the first day over and over and over again, and spending most of your time in only one town doing side quests? This sounds boring. But I was waiting for the inevitable 3DS remake, hoping that it would change my mind, and I finally played it for the first time in that version, and it really did. Majora's Mask is a very interesting game. There might only be one major town, but every NPC in the town has their own subplots, relationships, daily schedule. You really get to know all of them over the course of your adventure. If you like the movie Groundhog Day, and I do, this is basically a Groundhog Day license game. In a good way. And while there are only 4 dungeons, all of them are really well designed and have really great story leading up to them. Speaking of story, this game delves into some themes that Zelda games rarely touch on. Things like the loss of loved ones, or the panic people feel knowing that their death is inevitable within the next few days. The main villain even is just a lonely boy who just happened to find an evil artifact and get consumed by it. And his 2 fairy friends are just desperately trying to bring him back. But despite that, it never feels excessively grimdark either. I'd say there's not a lot in this game, but it doesn't feel like there's anything that's wasted either. Every side quest, every location has a purpose. And by the end of it, you get attached to the world and the characters in a way that I just never felt with any game in the series before. It's not an experience for everyone, but it's one that I personally came out of really enjoying. And now, number 2, Wind Waker. This is a game that is one of my favourites of all time, and it's a little hard to explain why, and it might just be nostalgia because this was the 3rd game in the series I played, after Ocarina of Time and Oracle of Ages. But if I could sum up this game in one word, it would be personality. Everything in this game just oozes personality. Even the owners of minigames have personality. Kaboom! Smash! And on that note, I just realized while making this video, this game has my favorite incarnations of Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf in the series. And since they're the 3 main pillars of the Zelda story, then that's gotta be a good thing. Link's facial expressions just have so much depth to them, and they add so much to his character even though he never speaks. Zelda's a more active player in the story, at least for most of it, but more importantly, she has an actual distinct personality this time. And Ganondorf has a great ominous presence throughout the whole game, and his voice actor's performance on the insane broken laughter right before the final battle is actually some of the best voice acting I've seen in a video game, and this is for a game that only voices random grunts. It also has some great dungeons, all of its towns are really memorable, every single tile of the Great Sea has a new island for you to explore. A lot of the dungeon items still have uses outside their dungeons, and many of them are really fun to use in both combat and puzzle solving. In particular, try a 3-heart hero run of this game, you'll definitely make good use of tools like the hammer and boomerang. This game isn't without its flaws though. In particular, I do think the last act of the game drags a bit. You can tell they had to cut a few dungeons for time, and there's also the Triforce quest, which thankfully the remake version simplifies. I also feel like this game has a bit of a bloat of collectibles. The sheer number of types of charts you can find, as well as treasure charts that mostly just lead to money or nothing special. They could probably afford to cut down on that without really hurting the experience. I've also started to realize recently that while I like the final battle conceptually and its atmosphere, I'm not sure I really like it gameplay-wise compared to some other final bosses in the series. But in spite of all that, this is still my second favourite game in the whole series, so, well, you know what my favourite is, and obviously this is going to be a really controversial choice, but here we go. Number 1 is Skyward Sword, and I didn't know that the remake would be announced when I made this list. It says a lot about me that Skyward Sword is my favourite Zelda game. It's really a sign of what I like in the series. Puzzles, combats, items, and story and memorable characters. Not so much exploration, so I really don't mind this game's linearity at all. Many of the things that for some people are flaws with this game are actually strengths for me. I will say, I don't have entirely positive thoughts on it. There's the whole redundant explanation thing, as well as everything and anything to do with Scrapper, one of the worst characters in the whole series, both for personality and for what he makes you go through, and there are a few points in the game that feel like padding. Especially having to revisit every area again for the 3rd act and all the fights with the imprisoned. But just like I said, I enjoy it when I like something in spite of its flaws, and the strengths of this game really shine to me. Namely, the characters. Groose is one of the rare examples of a character who seems like a generic bully, but actually becomes a really deep character later on. This version of Zelda's pretty good, and her relationship with Link actually gets development. Impa has a major role during the storyline. Link himself emotes quite a bit. He's kind of what you'd get if you fused Wind Waker and Twilight Princess's versions of Link. And Girahim is a really, really great villain. Though, character-wise, I will say there is one major flaw, and that is Fi or however you say it. I fully agree that she is the worst Navi-type character in the series, though I will say, Hyrule Warriors improved her a lot. It's kind of amazing how much better she is there. But I think the main reason this game ranks so highly for me is the combat. Remember what I said about Zelda 2's combat? This is basically a modern version of that. You have to really think what direction you're swinging your sword in. And different enemies have different weaknesses. Even things as simple as bokoblins and skulltulas can actually wreck you if you're not careful. But in addition to the sword, pretty much every dungeon item has a lot of practical use in combat and exploration outside of its debut dungeon. The bow in particular, working kind of like a fantasy sniper rifle in this game, is pretty great. The beetle can be used to stun some enemies from great distances. The whip can pull certain enemies' weapons out of their hands. Bombs and shields have a lot of creative uses. This, I find, is one of the most fun Zelda games to do a low-heart challenge run of, because of all of the tools you have available at any given time, and all of them are really useful in helping you survive. I also really like the dungeons of this game. There aren't as many as Twilight Princess, but most of them are pretty memorable. The only one that I'd say is a real dud is... well, it says something that I can't even remember its name. It's the second fire dungeon. But especially the Sand Ship and the Ancient Cistern are two of my favourite dungeons in all of Zelda. Which really says something when one of them's a water dungeon. I don't really mind the motion controls either. I feel like they're pretty responsive. The forward stab is really the main point of contention, especially against some enemies like Beamos that will brutally kill you if you don't get the forward stab right. But I'm hoping this gets easier in the new control scheme in the Switch version, which might actually encourage some people who passed on this game because of the motion controls to give it a try. It does really say something though that even the series creator had to tell people, look, this game is very different from Breath of the Wild, this is back when we still had a formula, so you may not enjoy it if you like that game. Breath of the Wild is very much the anti-Skyward Sword, and the fact that it even exists probably shows that even Nintendo doesn't really care for Skyward Sword anymore. But hey, Skyward Sword will always be around for someone like me who actually does like it. And I'll probably keep coming back to it. In fact, here is the biggest indication of how much I love this game. The first time I finished it, I immediately started up a new run as a 6-heart hero mode playthrough. It is very rare for me to replay a game immediately after finishing it the first time. I could talk more about how I feel this game's reputation on the internet developed, but I don't want to go into anything negative here. I just want to say I like this game, so I want to talk about why I like it, and I just have. And with that, that is my ranking of all the Zelda games. Again, only my personal opinion. And feel free to discuss anything you want to about this series in the comments section. While Zelda might not be nearly as important to me as a franchise as, say, Pokemon, Fire Emblem, or Persona is, I've still played many of these games growing up, and I really like most of them, so these are my opinions, and I will see you again next time for more thoughts on various games.